My name is Diane, and I'm 47 years old. I was standing at the bar with a champagne flute in my hand, watching 300 guests mingle at my son's wedding reception in this gorgeous Connecticut venue. Everything was perfect. The flowers, the music, the joy on Liam's face as he held his new bride Harper close. Then my father Gerald approached the microphone during the speeches, and what he said next would change everything. He gestured toward me with a cruel smile and announced to every single person in that room, including distant relatives who'd traveled from across the country, that I was the family embarrassment. 300 pairs of eyes turned to stare at me. My son Liam, 24 years old and freshly married, froze mid-conversation. Camera flashes captured my mortified expression as cruel laughter rippled through the crowd like poison. Before we dive into what happened next, I need to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments below. And if you've ever felt like the black sheep in your own family, hit that like button right now because you're going to want to hear how this story ends. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications because what my father did next, and what I did in response, will leave you speechless. Trust me, this is a story about justice, and it's only just beginning. The morning had started like something out of a fairy tale. I'd woken up at 5 in the morning, driven to the bridal suite at the hotel, and spent 3 hours helping Harper into her dress. Shed looked at me with tears in her eyes and said I was the mother Shed always wished for. Her own mom had passed away when she was 16, and Shed told me more than once that having me in her life felt like a gift. We'd laughed together as her bridesmaids fussed over the veil, and I'd felt this overwhelming pride knowing that my son had chosen such a kind, intelligent woman to share his life with. I'd contributed $15,000 to this wedding, money I'd saved from my teaching salary over 2 years, tutoring kids after school and working summer programs. Every penny was worth it to see Liam this happy. The ceremony itself had been breathtaking. They'd chosen an outdoor garden setting with a string quartet playing as Harper walked down the aisle. When Liam saw her, Head actually started crying, and I'd watched my baby boy, now a grown man who'd just finished his first year of medical residency, promise to love and cherish this woman for the rest of his life. I'd thought about all the sacrifices, all the nights I'd worked double shifts as a single mother, all the times I'd gone without, so he could have what he needed. Liam was the first person in my immediate family to graduate from medical school, and seeing him standing there in his tuxedo, confident and happy, made every struggle worth it. The reception had transitioned seamlessly from the ceremony, with guests moving into the elegant ballroom where round tables were decorated with cream roses and gold accents. Everything was perfect until the speeches began. My father, Gerald, 72 years old and still commanding attention wherever he went, hadn't been invited to give a speech. The program clearly listed the best man, the maid of honor, and myself as the speakers. But Gerald had never been one to follow rules, especially rules that didn't center him. He walked up to the microphone while the best man was gathering his notes, and he simply took it. The DJ looked confused but didn't stop him. Gerald tapped the microphone twice, and the room fell silent. That's when he said it. He gestured toward me with this theatrical wave of his hand and said, "Most of you know my successful sons, Kenneth and Raymond, but let me introduce the one we don't talk about much, the family embarrassment, Diane." The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt my heart start pounding so hard I thought it might explode out of my chest. My vision blurred at the edges, and my hands began trembling so violently that champagne sloshed over the rim of my glass. I watched my mother Constance look away, suddenly fascinated by the floral centerpiece on her table. My brothers, Kenneth and Raymond, were actually smirking, like this was some kind of inside joke that all agreed upon. My sister-in-law, Lillian, leaned over to whisper something to the woman next to her, and they both glanced at me with what I can only describe as pity mixed with schadenfreude. Gerald wasn't finished. He continued, making jokes about my failed marriage to Derek, about my mediocre teaching job that barely paid the bills, about how I'd never lived up to my potential the way my brothers had. He talked about how I'd embarrassed the family by getting divorced 15 years ago, how I'd raised Liam in a tiny apartment instead of giving him the privileged upbringing my nephews had enjoyed. How Eid chosen a path of struggle instead of staying in a marriage like a decent woman should. Every word was a knife, and he was stabbing me in front of everyone I cared about. Everyone Liam cared about. Everyone who was supposed to be celebrating love and new beginnings. The room had gone completely silent except for Gerald's voice. Then, slowly, some of his friends started laughing. Nervous, uncomfortable laughter that made everything so much worse. I could see Liam starting to stand up, his face red with anger, but Harper grabbed his arm and held him back, probably trying to prevent a scene that would overshadow their entire wedding day. The best man, a friend of Liam's named Marcus, finally managed to take the microphone back, making some joke about unexpected entertainment and trying desperately to redirect the energy in the room. But the damage was done. I set down my champagne glass because I couldn't trust my hands not to drop it, and I walked as calmly as I could toward the bathroom. My legs felt like they might give out at any moment. I made it into a stall just as the first sob broke free from my chest. That's where Harper's bridesmaid Naomi found me 10 minutes later, mascara streaming down my face, trying to breathe through the humiliation. She hugged me and told me that everyone in that room knew Gerald was a monster, but her kindness somehow made it hurt more. I had a choice in that moment. I could leave, drive home, and let my absence speak for itself. Or I could stay for my son, hold my head up, and refuse to give Gerald the satisfaction of driving me away. I chose to stay, but that humiliation burned in my chest for the rest of the night like acid. My ex-husband Derek was there, sitting at a table near the back. We'd maintained a friendly relationship after the divorce, mostly for Liam's sake, and I could see the sympathy on his face as he watched me return to the reception. My childhood friend Heather, one of only 2 people in that room who truly understood my history with my family, rushed over the moment she saw me and squeezed my hand so hard it hurt. But 250 guests had just watched my father publicly humiliate me, and now they were all looking at me through the lens Head created. The family embarrassment, the failure, the disappointment. I smiled through the rest of the reception, danced with Liam during the mother-son dance while fighting back tears, and pretended that everything was fine. But inside, something had broken. Or maybe, something had finally woken up. To understand why Gerald hated me so much, you have to go back 15 years. I was 32 years old, married to Derek, and absolutely miserable. On the surface, everything looked fine. Derek had a good job in finance, we had a nice house in the suburbs, and Liam was 9 years old and thriving in school. But behind closed doors, Derek was controlling every aspect of my life. He monitored every dollar I spent, questioned every friend I talked to, and slowly isolated me from anyone who might have helped me see how abnormal our relationship had become. He never hit me, but emotional abuse leaves scars that are just as deep. When I finally found the courage to file for divorce, I thought my family would support me. I was wrong. Gerald had exploded when I told him, actually screaming at me in the middle of a family dinner that I was embarrassing the Sawyer name, that divorce was shameful, that I was weak and selfish for giving up on my marriage. He didn't ask why I was leaving. He didn't care that Derek had made me feel like a prisoner in my own home. All he cared about was appearances, and Id shattered the illusion of his perfect family. Id chosen single motherhood, and it had been the hardest thing Id ever done. I worked 2 jobs for years, one as a full-time teacher and another tutoring students in the evenings and on weekends. There were months when I had to choose between paying the electric bill and buying new shoes for Liam's growing feet. There were nights when I ate peanut butter sandwiches for dinner so Liam could have something more substantial. But Wed made it work, and more importantly, Liam had grown up in a home without tension, without the constant walking on eggshells that had defined his early childhood. Head thrived. Head gotten a full scholarship to college, worked his way through medical school with a combination of loans and part-time jobs, and now he was building a life with a woman who adored him. I'd done that. Not my wealthy father, not my successful brothers, but me, the family embarrassment. The divide in my family had always been clear. My brother Kenneth was a corporate lawyer who specialized in real estate contracts. He made partner at his firm before he turned 40, married a woman whose family had old money, and lived in a mansion in Greenwich with a view of the water. He was Gerald's favorite, the golden child who could do no wrong. My brother Raymond had followed in Gerald's footsteps, becoming a real estate developer and working directly for the family business, Sawyer Construction and Development. Had married young, had 3 kids, and spent every Sunday having dinner with our parents. Then there was my sister, Beatrice, who'd married at 21 to a man Gerald approved of, became a homemaker, and spent her days volunteering at the country club and organizing charity events. They were the success stories. They'd followed the script Gerald had written for his children, and they'd been rewarded with money, approval, and inclusion in the family's inner circle. I'd gone to college on a scholarship, something Gerald had resented because it meant I wasn't dependent on him for tuition. I'd pursued teaching because I loved it, not because it would make me wealthy. I'd married Derek because I loved him, not because he came from the right family or had the right connections. And when that marriage became unbearable, I'd left, prioritizing my happiness and safety over maintaining appearances. Every single one of those choices had been an act of rebellion in Gerald's eyes, and had never forgiven me for it. Every holiday gathering was an exercise in subtle torture. Kenneth would talk about his latest case or his vacation home in the Hamptons. Raymond would discuss expansion plans for the business. Beatrice would show off photos of her kids' private school achievements, and I would sit there, knowing that everything about my life was viewed as lesser, as proof that I'd made the wrong choices. Liam's childhood had been marked by that inequality. His cousins got brand new cars for their 16th birthdays while Liam got a used bicycle. They went on ski trips to Colorado and beach vacations in the Caribbean, while Liam and I spent summers at the public pool. They had trust funds set up for college while Liam applied for every scholarship he could find. Gerald had made sure the disparities were obvious, a constant reminder that this was what happened when you disappointed him. But here's what Gerald never understood. Liam didn't resent me for any of it. Head told me once, when he was in high school, that he was grateful Head learned the value of hard work, and that He'd rather have a mother who actually loved him than a trust fund from a grandfather who only cared about control. That conversation had made me cry for an hour after he went to bed. Gerald's control tactics extended far beyond just money. Financially, Head cut me out of his will years ago, making sure I knew that I'd never inherit a penny from the Sawyer fortune. He flaunted his wealth to my brothers, taking them on trips and buying them expensive gifts, always making sure I heard about it secondhand. Socially, he told extended family members lies about me, painting me as unstable, selfish, and ungrateful. Cousins I'd grown up with started avoiding me at gatherings, and I later found out it was because Gerald had told them I'd stolen money from the family or made up abuse allegations against Derek to justify my divorce. None of it was true, but Gerald was charismatic and convincing, and people believed him. Emotionally, he never missed an opportunity to call me a disappointment. At my college graduation, Head told me that teaching was a waste of my intelligence. When I bought my first car with money I'd saved myself, Head commented that it was a shame I had to settle for something so cheap. Every accomplishment was diminished. Every struggle was proof of my poor choices. The first real attack had happened when Liam was 12 years old. Gerald had pulled him aside during a Thanksgiving dinner and told him, in front of several cousins, that his mother's choices had ruined the family, that I'd destroyed a perfectly good marriage because I was too selfish to work on my problems, and that Liam should be ashamed to be associated with me. Liam had come home in tears, asking me if it was true, if I was a bad person like Grandpa said. It had to sit my 12-year-old son down and explain things no child should have to hear about his father, about abuse, about why sometimes leaving is the bravest thing you can do. It had taken months to rebuild Liam's trust and help him understand that Gerald's version of events was poison disguised as concern. And now, 15 years later, Gerald was still at it, still trying to destroy me in front of the people I loved. When Liam had gotten engaged to Harper 6 months earlier, I'd known there would be drama around the wedding. Gerald had initially refused to attend, telling my mother that he wouldn't celebrate anything connected to that woman, meaning me. My mother Constance had convinced him to go, arguing that it would look bad if he didn't attend his own grandson's wedding, that people would ask questions. Id suspected Head caused trouble, but Id hoped, naively, that Head behave himself for Liam's sake, that maybe this one day could be about joy instead of cruelty. I should have known better. Gerald had spent 47 years making sure I understood my place in his hierarchy, and he wasn't about to stop just because it was his grandson's wedding day. If anything, having a captive audience of 300 people had probably made the opportunity too good to resist. The confrontation happened less than 30 minutes after Gerald's speech. Liam had waited until the formal toasts were finished and the dancing had started, probably trying to avoid causing an even bigger scene, but his anger was written all over his face as he approached the table where Gerald sat, surrounded by Kenneth, Raymond, and their wives. I was standing near the dessert table with Harper when I saw it happen. Liam walked right up to his grandfather and said, loud enough that several nearby tables could hear, "How could you do that to Mom?" Gerald barely looked up from his whiskey, waving his hand dismissively like Liam was an annoying child, interrupting adult conversation. He said Head spoken the truth, that Liam shouldn't be so sensitive, that maybe if I'd been a better daughter and wife, there wouldn't be anything embarrassing to point out. The casual cruelty in his voice, the complete lack of remorse, was stunning even for Gerald. Kenneth and Raymond immediately jumped to their father's defense, both standing up like they were preparing for physical confrontation. Kenneth, ever the lawyer, said Gerald was just being honest, that I'd always been difficult and overly emotional, that I'd brought this on myself by making poor life choices. Raymond added that if I'd stayed married like a decent woman instead of dragging the family name through a divorce, maybe Gerald wouldn't have to point out my failures. My sister Beatrice, who'd been sitting quietly, suddenly spoke up too, saying that maybe if I'd tried harder to make my marriage work, if I'd been less selfish, Gerald wouldn't feel compelled to tell the truth about me. The three of them, my own siblings, were ganging up on my son at his own wedding reception because Head dared to defend his mother. I felt Harper's hand grip mine tightly, and when I looked at her, there were tears in her eyes, but they were tears of anger, not sadness. That's when my first ally stepped forward. Heather, my friend since childhood, had been watching from a nearby table, and she stood up and walked directly into the middle of that confrontation. She'd known my family for decades, had watched Gerald manipulate and abuse me for years, and she was done staying silent. She told Gerald, in front of everyone at those surrounding tables, that he was a cruel old man who'd spent his entire life tearing down his own daughter because he couldn't control her. She said that everyone in that family knew the truth about why I'd divorced Derek, that Derek had been emotionally abusive and controlling, and that I'd shown more courage in leaving than any of them had shown in their entire pampered lives. The look on Gerald's face was priceless, shock and rage mixing together as someone finally challenged him publicly. Then came the second ally, and this one surprised everyone, including me. Derek, my ex-husband, had been sitting quietly at his table, but he stood up and walked over. For a moment I thought he might make things worse, but instead he looked Gerald straight in the eye and said something I never expected to hear. He admitted that Gerald was a cruel old man, that I'd left him because He'd been a terrible husband, not because of any failing on my part. He said He'd been controlling, emotionally manipulative, and that I'd done the right thing by taking Liam and building a better life. He said He'd spent years in therapy dealing with his own issues, and that the best thing I'd ever done was refuse to tolerate his behavior. Derek's voice was steady and clear, and everyone in earshot could hear every word. The shock in the room was palpable. My ex-husband, the man Gerald had always blamed me for leaving, was defending me and admitting his own faults publicly. Gerald's rage was immediate and volcanic. His face turned red, and he pushed back from the table so hard his chair nearly tipped over. He announced that he didn't have to tolerate this disrespect, that this wedding had been a mistake, that he was leaving and wouldn't be subjected to lies and attacks. My mother Constance grabbed his arm, begging him to calm down, to sit back down, not to make a scene, but Gerald shook her off like she was nothing. Then he delivered his final blow, pointing at Liam and declaring that if Liam chose to side with me, his lying, manipulative mother, then Liam was no longer welcome at family gatherings. He said that any relationship between them was over, that he wouldn't have a grandson who disrespected him like this, and that Liam could choose right now, his mother or his family. The ultimatum hung in the air like poison gas. Liam didn't hesitate for even a second. He stepped forward, standing right in front of Gerald, and told him in a clear, firm voice that he was done with him. He said he'd spent his entire childhood watching his mother be mistreated, watching her work herself to exhaustion, while Gerald threw money at his golden children and ignored the grandson who actually needed help. He said that Gerald had never once asked how he was doing in school, never attended a single one of his soccer games or academic awards ceremonies, never offered to help with college or medical school, but now wanted to dictate who Liam could love and support. Liam told him that if he had to choose between his mother and a family that treated her like garbage, there was no choice at all. Then Liam did something that made my heart swell with pride and break with sadness at the same time. He turned his back on Gerald and walked away, taking Harper's hand and leading her toward the dance floor where the DJ was trying desperately to restart the music and salvage the party atmosphere. Gerald stormed out of the reception with my mother trailing behind him, but not before announcing one more time to anyone who would listen that I'd turned his grandson against him, that I was manipulative and vindictive, that this whole family would regret siding with me. Kenneth and Raymond followed their father out, along with their wives and children, a whole exodus of Sawyers abandoning the wedding like it had been contaminated. My sister Beatrice stayed, but only because her husband convinced her it would look even worse if the entire family left. She sat at her table for the rest of the night with a pinched expression on her face, making it clear that she was deeply unhappy about everything that had transpired. About 20 other guests, mostly Gerald's friends and business associates, left shortly after he did, probably worried about being associated with whatever drama was unfolding. I found a quiet corner behind the bar area and just stood there for a moment, trying to process what had happened. Liam and Harper found me there a few minutes later. Liam wrapped his arms around me, and I started crying, apologizing over and over for ruining his wedding day. But Liam stopped me, holding my face in his hands the way I used to do when he was little, and he told me I hadn't ruined anything. He said Gerald had shown his true colors, that he was glad it happened because now everyone knew exactly who his grandfather really was, and that he was done pretending to respect a man who'd never shown me any respect. Harper agreed, saying it'd been nothing but kind and welcoming to her, that she was honored to have me as her mother-in-law, and that Gerald was the embarrassment, not me. Their words were meant to comfort me, but all I could think about was how my father had just tried to destroy me in front of 300 people, and how this war I'd been avoiding my entire life had finally begun. The reception continued, but the joy had been sucked out of it. Guests were uncomfortable. Conversations were stilted, and I could see people glancing at me with a mixture of pity and curiosity. I stayed until the very end, because I'd promised Liam I would, but the moment they left for their hotel, I got in my car and drove home alone. My apartment felt emptier than usual that night. I sat on my couch still wearing my dress from the wedding, looking at photos on my phone of Liam when he was little, and I cried until there was nothing left. I'd spent decades accepting Gerald's treatment, telling myself it didn't matter, that I was strong enough to handle it, that eventually he'd see I wasn't the failure he thought I was. But sitting there at 2 a.m, mascara staining my dress, I realized something. He was never going to change. He was never going to apologize. He was never going to see me as anything other than the daughter who'd defied him, and he would spend the rest of his life punishing me for it. That's when a thought occurred to me, quiet at first but growing louder. What if I stopped being silent? What if I stopped accepting this? What if I fought back? At midnight, my phone rang. It was Gerald, and I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. His voice was venomous, screaming that I'd turned his grandson against him, that I was a manipulative witch who'd poisoned Liam's mind, that I'd regret what I'd done. He ranted for 5 straight minutes about my failures, my selfishness, my complete lack of family loyalty. And for the first time in my life, instead of crying or defending myself, I felt something else. I felt anger, clean and sharp and clarifying. When he finally paused to take a breath, I said just 3 words. "I'm done, Dad." Then I hung up and blocked his number. It was the first time I'd ever hung up on my father. It was the first time I'd ever set a boundary that couldn't be crossed. And sitting there in my dark apartment, I realized that something fundamental had shifted. I'd been attacked, humiliated, and pushed to my absolute limit. Gerald had wanted to break me at that wedding. What had actually done was wake me up. Monday morning came too fast. I dragged myself into school still exhausted from the emotional devastation of the weekend, and I must have looked terrible because my colleague Margaret took one look at me in the teacher's lounge and immediately asked what was wrong. Margaret and I had been teaching in adjacent classrooms for 8 years, and she'd become a friend, someone I trusted. I told her everything, the whole humiliating story of what Gerald had done at the wedding, and she listened with increasing horror. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that changed everything. She asked if I'd ever looked into my family's business dealings, and the question caught me completely off guard. Margaret explained that her husband Phil was a forensic accountant and had mentioned months ago that a company called Sawyer Construction and Development had been flagged in some investigation Head worked on peripherally. I'd never paid much attention to the family business. Gerald had made it clear decades ago that I wasn't welcome in that world, that it was reserved for my brothers, the real Sawyers who could be trusted with the legacy Head built. But sitting there with Margaret, something clicked in my brain. Gerald had always been obsessed with money and status. Head always valued success above everything else. What if there was something wrong with the source of all that wealth and power he lorded over everyone? Margaret could see the wheels turning in my head, and she wrote down Phil's phone number, telling me to call him if I wanted more information. I spent the rest of that school day distracted, barely able to focus on my students. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop and started researching. I typed Sawyer Construction and Development into Google, and what came back made my stomach drop. There were multiple lawsuits from subcontractors claiming they'd never been paid for work they'd completed. Online reviews from customers complained about shoddy work, missed deadlines, and serious code violations that had cost them thousands of dollars to fix. But what really caught my attention was a news article from 6 months earlier with the headline, "City Officials Investigating Local Developer for Permit Fraud." The article specifically named Sawyer Construction and mentioned that the city had received multiple complaints about projects that didn't match approved permits, buildings that had been constructed without proper inspections, and bribes allegedly paid to building inspectors to overlook violations. I kept digging, falling down a rabbit hole of public records and court documents. I found 3 liens against properties owned by Gerald's company, meaning creditors had legal claims because they hadn't been paid. I discovered a pending lawsuit from a construction worker who'd been seriously injured on a Sawyer construction site, claiming the company had ignored safety regulations and refused to cover his medical bills. With every new piece of information, a picture was forming, and it wasn't pretty. The business my father had built his fortune on, the business he was so proud of, the business that had funded my brother's lavish lifestyles and created the wealth he used to control everyone around him, appeared to be deeply corrupt. I remembered something then, a conversation from years ago that I'd mostly forgotten. When I was still married to Derek, maybe a year before I filed for divorce, Gerald had approached Derek at a family dinner and asked him to do something with an insurance claim. Derek worked in finance and had connections with insurance companies, and Gerald wanted him to falsify some documentation to inflate a claim the business was making. Derek had refused, and Gerald had been furious. That incident had been part of why Gerald hated Derek even before our divorce, why Head never truly accepted him as part of the family. At the time, I'd thought it was just a misunderstanding, that surely Gerald hadn't really been asking Derek to do something illegal. But now, with all this information in front of me, I realized Derek had been telling the truth. Gerald had asked him to commit fraud, and when Derek said no, Gerald had turned against him. I called Derek that night, the first real conversation we'd had since the wedding. I asked him point blank if he remembered that incident with the insurance claim, and there was a long pause before he answered. He said yes. He remembered it very clearly, because it had been the moment he realized what kind of man Gerald really was. He told me that Gerald had wanted him to claim that building materials worth $50,000 had been stolen from a job site when they'd actually been used on a different project, essentially trying to get insurance to pay for materials twice. Derek said he'd refused and threatened to report it, and Gerald had backed down but never forgiven him. Derek said it was one of the reasons our marriage had been so strained, because Gerald had made it clear Derek wasn't welcome in the family, and I'd been caught in the middle trying to maintain peace. This new information was like a missing puzzle piece sliding into place. I spent the next 3 days researching every spare moment I had. I looked through public records, read court filings, searched news archives, and followed every thread I could find. The evidence kept piling up. There were shell companies registered in Delaware that appeared to be connected to Sawyer Construction but had no clear business purpose. There were financial red flags all over the place, including the recent transfer of significant assets to offshore accounts, something I only discovered because one disgruntled creditor had mentioned it in a lawsuit filing. And then there was the lawsuit from the injured construction worker, a man named Russell Hoffman who'd fallen 3 stories when scaffolding collapsed. The lawsuit claimed that Sawyer Construction had used substandard materials, ignored safety inspections, and then tried to blame Russell for his own injuries to avoid paying workers' compensation. I started having a moral crisis. What I was uncovering suggested that my father wasn't just cruel and controlling, he was potentially a criminal. Kenneth, my lawyer brother, appeared to be involved too, based on court documents showing he was the attorney of record for the company on multiple questionable filings. Raymond, as a property manager and developer working directly under Gerald, had to know what was going on. This wasn't just one bad decision or a minor ethical lapse. This looked like systematic fraud going back years, maybe decades. If I pursued this, if I exposed what I was finding, I could destroy my entire family. Gerald would face serious legal consequences. Kenneth could be disbarred. Raymond could lose everything. Even my mother, who'd spent 50 years married to Gerald, would be devastated financially and socially. But then I thought about what they'd done to me. I thought about 47 years of being told I wasn't good enough, being excluded and diminished and humiliated. I thought about my father standing at a microphone at my son's wedding and calling me the family embarrassment in front of 300 people. I thought about my brother smirking and my sister saying I'd brought it on myself and my mother looking away like she always did, choosing to protect Gerald instead of her own daughter. I thought about the ultimatum Gerald had given Liam, trying to force my son to choose between his mother and his grandfather. And I thought about all the people Gerald had hurt in his business dealings, the workers who hadn't been paid, the customers who'd been defrauded, the man lying in a hospital bed with a shattered spine because Gerald had cut corners on safety equipment to save money. I called Heather and told her everything I'd found. She was quiet for a long time after I finished, and then she said something that resonated deep in my bones. She said Gerald was never going to change, that he'd spend the rest of his life hurting me if I let him, and that sometimes the only way to stop an abuser was to take away their power completely. I thought about Liam and about the baby he and Harper were probably going to have someday, and I realized I wanted my son to see me stand up for myself. I wanted my future grandchildren to know that their grandmother had been strong enough to fight back when it mattered. So I made a decision. I was going to investigate further, gather as much evidence as I could, and when the time was right, I was going to expose everything, not just for me, but for everyone Gerald had ever hurt. 2 days later, my phone rang, and it was Kenneth. His voice was cold and threatening, and he told me that I'd better be very careful about spreading lies regarding the family business. I asked him how he even knew I'd been looking into it, and he said they had ways of knowing when people made inquiries about the company. That confirmed something I'd suspected. They were monitoring something, maybe search alerts or court record access logs. Kenneth said that if I made any accusations, if I told anyone what I thought I'd found, they would sue me for defamation and destroy me financially. He said I couldn't afford a legal battle, that I'd lose everything, including my teaching job, and that I should remember my place in this family and stay silent. Then he hung up. But his threat had the opposite effect of what he intended. It told me I was onto something real, something big enough that they were scared. And that made me more determined than ever to keep digging. 2 weeks after the wedding, my mother called. Her voice sounded strained, almost pleading, and she said Gerald wanted to have a family meeting. I asked her why on earth I would attend anything Gerald organized after what he'd done, and she said he was talking about changing his will, that I should be there to hear what he had to say. I knew it was probably a trap. My father didn't do anything without a strategic purpose, and inviting me to a meeting about his estate when he'd spent years making it clear I'd never inherit anything seemed suspicious. But I also wanted to see my brothers' faces, to watch how they reacted to questions about the business, to maybe gather more information about what they were hiding. So I agreed to come, telling my mother I'd be there but not promising to stay if things got ugly. The meeting was at my parents' house, a sprawling estate in Greenwich that Gerald had bought 30 years ago as a symbol of his success. The driveway was lined with expensive cars: Kenneth's Mercedes, Raymond's BMW, Beatrice's Lexus. I pulled up in my 12-year-old Honda Civic, and the contrast wasn't lost on me. Inside, everyone was already gathered in the formal dining room. Gerald sat at the head of the long table like a king holding court. Kenneth was to his right, Raymond to his left. Beatrice sat next to Raymond with her husband, and their spouses filled out the rest of the seats. My mother was at the far end of the table, her hands folded in her lap, not making eye contact with anyone. The atmosphere was hostile and cold, and I could feel everyone's judgment the moment I walked in. Gerald didn't waste time with pleasantries. He announced that he was updating his estate plan and wanted to clarify distributions to avoid any confusion after he died. Kenneth would get the company. Raymond would get the property portfolio, including several rental buildings and commercial spaces. Beatrice would get the investment portfolio, stocks and bonds worth at least $2 million. I sat there listening, waiting for what I knew was coming. Then Gerald turned to me, and with this condescending smile, he said he was leaving me Mother's china set and the family photo albums. He called it the sentimental junk. Things that had emotional value but not much financial worth. He said it like he was doing me a favor, like I should be grateful for the scraps from his table. I didn't react the way he expected. Instead of getting upset or arguing, I simply said I assumed I was getting nothing as usual. Gerald's smile faltered for a second, like he'd been hoping for more of a reaction. Then Kenneth pulled out a document from his briefcase and slid it across the table toward me. He explained that it was a legal waiver, a document stating that I relinquished any future claim to Gerald's estate, that I acknowledged it'd been adequately provided for with the china and photos, and that I agreed never to contest the will or sue the estate after Gerald died. Kenneth, using his lawyer voice, said it was just a formality, that everyone was signing similar documents, and that it would make the probate process much smoother when the time came. But I'd been married to Derek long enough to know what legal coercion looked like, and this was it. This wasn't about estate planning. This was about making sure I could never claim I'd been unfairly disinherited, never challenge any of Gerald's decisions, never have any legal recourse if I discovered something that would entitle me to a portion of the estate. I looked at Kenneth and asked if I could review the document with my own lawyer first. The room went completely silent. Gerald's face turned red, and he slammed his hand on the table hard enough to make the water glasses shake. He said I didn't trust my own family, that this was exactly why I was the embarrassment, that I always had to make everything difficult and complicated when it should be simple. Kenneth leaned forward, his voice dropping into that threatening tone he used in courtrooms, and he told me I needed to sign now. He said those were the terms, that if I didn't sign immediately, I'd get nothing at all, not even the china, not even the photos. Raymond chimed in, saying I was being ridiculous, that this was just a formality and I was acting paranoid. Beatrice added that the china was actually quite valuable, and I should be grateful Gerald was being so generous. The three of them were tag-teaming me, pressuring me, trying to force me into signing away any rights I might have. I looked at my mother, hoping for some support, some acknowledgement that this was wrong. But Constance just sat there staring at her hands, silent and complicit like always. I took a deep breath and said, "Id, think about it." Gerald exploded again, standing up from his chair and yelling that I had 1 week to sign or I'd be completely cut off from the family. He said that meant no contact with my mother, no invitations to family events, nothing. He was trying to use my relationship with my mother as leverage, trying to force me into compliance by threatening the one family connection I still cared about. I stood up, gathered my purse, and told him I'd let him know my decision. Then I walked out, my heart pounding but my head held high. I'd refused to be bullied, and that small act of defiance felt like a victory even though my hands were shaking. I was halfway to my car when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around, expecting another confrontation, but it was Lillian, Raymond's wife. She looked nervous, glancing back at the house like she was afraid someone might see her talking to me. In a low voice, she told me to be careful. She said Shed overheard Raymond and Kenneth talking late one night about making sure I couldn't cause problems. She didn't know exactly what they meant, but they were scared of something, and they were planning something to keep me quiet. I asked her what kind of problems, and she shook her head, saying she didn't have details, just that I should watch my back. Then she hurried back into the house before anyone noticed she was gone. That conversation confirmed everything I'd suspected. My brothers knew the business had serious issues. They knew I'd been asking questions, and they were actively plotting to neutralize me as a threat. The waiver wasn't just about the estate, it was about protecting themselves from whatever I might discover or report. They wanted me to sign away my rights and my voice, to ensure I could never take legal action against them, or testify against them, or claim any stake in assets that might be seized if their criminal activities were exposed. This wasn't just about inheritance or family drama anymore. This was about covering up crimes, and they saw me as a liability that needed to be controlled or eliminated. I got in my car and drove straight home, my mind racing with the implications of what I'd just learned. I used $1,500 from my savings account, money had been setting aside for a summer vacation that now seemed impossibly frivolous, and I hired a private investigator. His name was Ross Murphy, and he came highly recommended by Phil, Margaret's husband who'd first tipped me off about Gerald's company. Ross was a former FBI agent who'd specialized in financial crimes before retiring and starting his own investigation firm. When I met him at a coffee shop near my apartment, I brought everything I'd collected: printed news articles, notes from public records, court documents I'd requested, the whole messy pile of evidence that suggested my father's business empire was built on fraud. Ross listened to my story without interrupting, taking notes on a yellow legal pad, and when I finished, he looked at me seriously and asked if I was sure I wanted to do this. He explained that once we started pulling threads, we couldn't unravel just part of the sweater. If Gerald's business was as dirty as I suspected, exposing it would have massive consequences for everyone involved. I told him I was sure. Within 1 week, Ross came back with findings that exceeded my worst fears. Sawyer Construction and Development had been systematically defrauding clients for at least 15 years. They'd bid on contracts using promises of high-quality materials and experienced workers, then substituted cheap alternatives and hired undocumented laborers they could pay under minimum wage. They'd bribed building inspectors to sign off on work that didn't meet code, and when problems inevitably surfaced, they'd used legal intimidation to silence complaints. Ross had found evidence of at least $18 million in fraudulent contracts, and that was just what he could confirm from public records. The actual number was probably much higher. Head also found shell companies in Delaware and the Cayman Islands that Gerald used to hide assets and avoid taxes, a scheme that Kenneth had helped set up using his legal expertise. But I didn't have time to fully process Ross' initial findings, because something happened that showed me just how deep the betrayal in my family ran. My cousin Sylvia, who was actually my mother's niece, called me out of the blue. Sylvia had always been friendly at family gatherings, one of the few relatives who seemed genuinely kind. She said Shed heard about what happened at the wedding and wanted to check on me. We talked for almost an hour, and I found myself opening up to her about how isolated I felt, how the family meeting had been so hostile, how I suspected my father's business wasn't as legitimate as everyone believed. I mentioned, casually, that had been looking into some public records and found some concerning information. Sylvia was sympathetic, asking questions and expressing shock that Gerald might be involved in anything improper. The next morning, I got a phone call from Kenneth, and he was absolutely livid. His first words were a demand to know who had told me to investigate the business. I said nobody had told me to do anything, that I'd done it on my own, and he cut me off. He said Sylvia had told them everything, that I'd hired an investigator, that I was trying to destroy the family. My stomach dropped. I'd trusted Sylvia, thought she was safe, and Shed reported our entire conversation back to Kenneth and Raymond. Kenneth's voice was shaking with rage as he told me I was making a huge mistake, that I didn't understand what I was dealing with, that if I continued down this path, there would be serious consequences. He didn't elaborate on what those consequences might be, but the threat in his voice was unmistakable. I hung up on him, my hands trembling, realizing that I couldn't trust anyone in my extended family. Sylvia had been planted to spy on me, or at the very least, Shed chosen loyalty to Gerald and my brothers over any genuine concern for me. That evening, something happened that escalated everything to a terrifying new level. I was in my apartment when the fire alarm went off. I grabbed my purse and phone and evacuated with the other residents, standing on the sidewalk watching firefighters investigate. It turned out to be a false alarm. Someone had pulled the alarm on the third floor, but while I was outside, the building manager pulled me aside. He looked concerned and told me that the parking garage security had reported something suspicious. Someone had been seen near my car earlier that afternoon, and when maintenance checked, they discovered that my brake lines had been cut. Not completely severed, but damaged enough that they would have failed eventually, probably the next time I tried to stop at high speed. I called the police, filed a report, but there was no security footage of that section of the garage, no witnesses, no proof of who had done it. The officer who took my statement said it could have been random vandalism, that sometimes teenagers did stupid, dangerous things, but I knew better. This had happened less than 24 hours after Kenneth learned I was investigating the business. Someone in my family, or someone working for them, had tried to hurt me. Maybe they'd meant to kill me, or maybe they'd just wanted to scare me, but either way, the message was clear. Back off or face worse consequences. I called Heather, and she insisted I stay with her. I packed a bag and drove to her house, my hands shaking the entire way, hyper-aware of every car that got too close, every turn I had to navigate. Ross called me at Heather's house the next day with expanded findings. Head dug deeper into Gerald's financial records using his FBI contacts and databases that regular people couldn't access. The $18 million in fraudulent contracts was just the beginning. Kenneth had helped Gerald hide evidence by falsifying legal documents, creating fake invoices, and using attorney-client privilege to shield communications that would have exposed the fraud. Raymond had been using company money for personal investments, buying rental properties in his own name with funds that should have been declared as income, and never reporting any of it to the IRS. All three men, Gerald, Kenneth, and Raymond, could face serious criminal charges if this evidence was turned over to authorities. We were talking about potential federal crimes, tax evasion, wire fraud, bribery, conspiracy. These weren't minor infractions. These were felonies that could result in years in prison. I had my first moment of near collapse that night. I was sitting in Heather's guest bedroom, staring at the walls, and I felt the weight of everything crushing me. My family had cut my brake lines. They were willing to physically harm me to keep their secrets safe. I thought about Liam, about how Head just started his life with Harper, about how they didn't deserve to be dragged into this nightmare. I picked up my phone and called him, not telling him about the brakes or the investigation, just needing to hear his voice. When he answered, cheerful and relaxed, asking how I was doing, I almost broke down crying. He immediately knew something was wrong and asked what was happening. I lied and said I was just missing him, that I'd been feeling emotional since the wedding. He told me he loved me, that I was the strongest person he knew, and that he was sorry his grandfather had hurt me. After we hung up, I sat there in the dark, wondering if I was strong enough to see this through. Derek showed up at Heather's house the next morning, which surprised both of us since I hadn't told him where I was staying. He explained that Liam had called him, worried about me, and asked him to check on me. Derek walked in carrying a manila folder, and when he sat down at Heather's kitchen table, he told me he had something I needed to see. Inside the folder were copies of documents from 15 years ago, from when Derek and I were still married. Gerald had approached Derek multiple times, asking him to help with various financial schemes, most of which Derek had refused. But Derek had kept copies of everything. Emails asking him to falsify insurance claims, memos about hiding income from the IRS, even a handwritten note from Gerald offering to pay Derek $20,000 if he'd help set up an offshore account to hide construction profits. Derek had kept these documents all these years as insurance, in case Gerald ever came after him or tried to harm Liam. Now he was giving them to me, saying I needed them more than he did, that it was time Gerald faced consequences for decades of illegal behavior. I looked at my ex-husband, this man I'd once loved and then left, and felt an overwhelming wave of gratitude. He was risking Gerald's wrath to help me, and that meant everything. 3 days after Derek gave me those documents, my mother called. Her voice was shaky and emotional, and she said that Gerald felt terrible about what happened at the wedding. She said he'd been doing a lot of thinking, that he realized he'd been too harsh, and that he wanted to make amends. I was immediately skeptical. Gerald didn't apologize. He didn't feel remorse. This was a man who'd been spent 47 years making my life miserable without a single moment of genuine regret. But my mother kept talking, saying that Gerald was planning a family dinner for his 73rd birthday, that he wanted everyone there, and that he'd specifically said he wanted to apologize to me publicly in front of the whole family. She was crying as she said this, begging me to come, saying she was old and tired and just wanted her family to be together before it was too late. I didn't believe Gerald's sudden change of heart, but I thought about it strategically. Ross had suggested I try to get Gerald on tape, admitting to something incriminating that we could use as evidence. A family gathering where people were drinking and emotions were high might be exactly the opportunity I needed. I told my mother I'd come, but I didn't promise to stay long. I specifically told her not to tell Liam about it because I didn't want him anywhere near whatever Gerald was planning. My mother sounded relieved and grateful, thanking me over and over, and I felt a pang of guilt for what I was about to do. But then I remembered how Shed sat silently at that family meeting while Gerald and my brothers tried to coerce me, and the guilt faded. The birthday dinner was at an upscale Italian restaurant in Stamford, a place Gerald liked because it had a private room for large parties. When I arrived, there were about 30 family members already there, aunts, uncles, cousins, and of course Gerald, Kenneth, Raymond, and Beatrice with their families. I was wearing a hidden recording device that Ross had given me, a tiny microphone clipped inside my jacket that would capture everything. Gerald greeted me at the door, and to anyone watching, he seemed warm and welcoming, giving me a hug and telling me he was glad I'd come. But I could feel the tension in his body, the calculation behind his eyes. This was performance, and I needed to stay alert to whatever was really happening. Dinner proceeded normally enough. People ate, drank wine, made toasts to Gerald's health and success. I sat near the end of the table, making small talk with a cousin I barely knew, watching my father hold court at the head of the table. Then, about an hour into the evening, Gerald stood up and said he wanted to talk to me privately before the cake was served. He said there were some things we needed to discuss, family matters, and that it would be better to have the conversation away from everyone else. My instincts were screaming that this was the trap, but I agreed, following him out of the private dining room and down a hallway to a smaller side room the restaurant used for business meetings. The moment I stepped into that room, I knew I'd made a terrible mistake. Kenneth and Raymond were already there, waiting. Gerald closed the door behind me and locked it. The 3 men stood between me and the only exit, and the look on their faces was pure malice. Kenneth spoke first, his voice cold and lawyer-precise, saying, "I'd been snooping where I didn't belong." Raymond added that they knew about my investigator, that they knew I'd been collecting information about the business. Gerald stepped closer, and I backed up instinctively until I hit the wall. He said I was going to sign a document right now, immediately, promising to never speak about the family business, to never share any information he'd gathered, to never contact authorities or journalists or anyone else with my accusations. Kenneth pulled out papers from his briefcase, and I recognized them immediately. It was an NDA, a non-disclosure agreement, but this version was even more aggressive than the waiver they'd tried to make me sign before. This document threatened massive legal action if I discussed the business in any way, released all claims to any estate assets, and included language that basically said I acknowledged I was making false accusations driven by mental instability and family grudges. They wanted me to sign a confession that I was lying about everything and to legally bind myself to silence forever. I said it was illegal coercion, that you couldn't force someone to sign away their rights to report crimes. Kenneth actually laughed and said who was going to believe me? The family disappointment who'd spent decades making poor choices and causing drama. He said no court, no authority, no journalist would take my word over theirs. Then Gerald said something that made my blood run cold. He said if I didn't sign immediately, they'd make sure Liam lost his medical license. I told him that was impossible, that Liam hadn't done anything wrong, that Head just finished his first year of residency with excellent evaluations. Raymond leaned in and explained, with this horrible smile, that they had connections throughout the medical community, that Kenneth knew people on medical licensing boards, that they could fabricate complaints about Liam's conduct, create false accusations of misconduct or incompetence, and drag his name through enough mud that his career would be destroyed before it really started. Gerald said that no hospital would want a doctor with that kind of cloud hanging over him, that it didn't matter if the accusations were true, just that they existed and would make Liam seem like a liability. I felt my knees go weak. They were threatening my son. They were willing to destroy Liam's entire future. Everything Head worked for, everything Id sacrificed for, just to keep me quiet about their crimes. I looked at the document on the table, at the pen Kenneth was holding out to me, and I seriously considered signing it. What was exposing Gerald's fraud worth if it cost my son his career? How could I live with myself if Liam's life was ruined because of choices Id made? My hand was actually reaching for the pen when the door opened, and I turned, hoping someone had heard what was happening and come to help. It was Beatrice, my sister, and for one brief moment I thought maybe she'd come to stop this, to stand up for me. But then she walked into the room, closed the door behind her, and said I should just sign the document and stop causing problems. She said I always made everything so difficult, that it'd been a burden to this family my entire life, and that the least I could do now was sign the paper and let everyone move on. She stood there with Gerald, Kenneth, and Raymond, a united front, and I realized my sister had known about this ambush all along. She was part of it, complicit in threatening my son and coercing me into silence. That betrayal, from someone I'd grown up with, someone who should have understood what it was like to be a woman in this family, hit me almost as hard as the threats themselves. I signed the document. My hand was shaking so badly I could barely write my name, but I signed it because I couldn't risk Liam's future. Gerald smiled, this triumphant, satisfied smile, and said, "See? That wasn't so hard." Kenneth took the papers, folded them carefully, and put them back in his briefcase. Raymond patted me on the shoulder in this condescending way and said Id made the right choice. Then they unlocked the door and let me leave. I walked out of that room, through the restaurant, past the private dining room where everyone was laughing and eating cake, and straight to my car. I sat in the driver's seat for 10 minutes, shaking and crying, feeling completely defeated. They'd won. They'd forced me into silence using the one thing I couldn't defend against, a threat to my child. But here's what they didn't know. The recording device in my jacket had captured everything. Every threat, every admission, every word of their conspiracy to obstruct justice and coerce me into signing that NDA. I drove straight to Ross' office even though it was 9 o'clock at night, and I played him the recording. He listened with increasing intensity, and when it finished, he looked at me and said this was exactly what we needed. The document Id signed under duress was legally invalid because they'd used threats and coercion, and I had proof. More importantly, the recording captured them discussing their plan to fabricate complaints against Liam, which was conspiracy to commit fraud and several other crimes. Ross asked me if I was ready for the nuclear option, for turning all of this over to federal authorities and watching my entire family face prosecution. I looked at him and said yes. They'd threatened my son. They'd gone too far, and now I was going to burn it all down. 2 days after I gave Ross permission to move forward, all hell broke loose. Federal investigators served notice to Sawyer Construction and Development that they were under investigation for tax evasion, fraud, and bribery. Someone, Ross wouldn't tell me exactly who, because he wanted to protect his sources, had tipped off the IRS and the FBI about Gerald's business dealings. The timing was too perfect to be coincidental, and Gerald immediately knew I had to be responsible. He couldn't prove it, but he knew. That same morning, Kenneth called me, and he was beyond angry. He was screaming into the phone, threatening to sue me for everything I had, saying I'd broken the NDA and they'd destroy me in court. I calmly reminded him that I'd signed that document under duress, with credible threats against my son, and that I had evidence. The line went silent for a moment, and then Kenneth said this wasn't over, and he hung up. That afternoon, I got a phone call that stopped my heart. The voice on the other end said she was calling from Yale New Haven Hospital, that my son Liam had been in a serious car accident, and that I needed to come immediately. I grabbed my keys and ran for my car, my mind spinning with terror. I drove 90 miles an hour down the highway, crying and praying, imagining the worst possible scenarios. When I got to the hospital and ran to the emergency room desk, frantic and asking for Liam Sawyer, the nurse looked confused. She checked her computer and said there was no patient by that name, no record of any accident victim matching that description. I called Liam's cell phone with shaking hands, and he answered on the second ring, confused about why I was calling and asking what was wrong. He was fine. He was at work at the hospital doing his residency shift. There had been no accident. I realized immediately what had happened. Someone had made a fake call to lure me away from my apartment. I drove home as fast as I could, my heart pounding with fear and rage, and when I got there, I found my apartment door hanging open, the lock broken. Someone had broken in while I was gone. The place had been ransacked. Drawers were pulled out, cushions torn apart, papers scattered everywhere. But the worst part was what they'd done to my walls. Spray painted in huge red letters across my living room wall was one word: stop. They'd stolen Ross files, everything he had kept at home related to the investigation, all my notes and printed documents. My laptop was gone too. The message was clear. We know where you live. We can get to you any time, and this is your last warning. I called the police again, filed another report, but I knew nothing would come of it. There were no witnesses, no fingerprints that would lead anywhere. I called Ross and told him what happened, and he said not to worry, that he had backup copies of everything, that they'd just stolen duplicates. But that wasn't the point. The point was that they'd violated my home, my safe space, and made it clear they were willing to escalate as far as necessary to stop me. I sat on my couch, or what was left of it after they'd slashed the cushions, and I broke down completely. This was the second time I felt truly defeated, like maybe I wasn't strong enough to fight back against people who had no limits, no morals, no boundaries they wouldn't cross. Heather came over within 20 minutes of my call, took one look at the destruction, and started helping me pack. She said I couldn't stay there, that it wasn't safe, and that I was going to live with her until this was over. Derek showed up an hour later, having heard from Heather what happened, and he looked as shaken as I felt. He helped us pack my clothes and essential belongings, and he kept saying he was sorry, that he should have warned me how dangerous Gerald could be. But then Liam arrived, and he was furious. Harper was with him, and they both looked at the destroyed apartment with horror. Liam demanded I tell him everything, every detail of what was happening, and I was too tired and broken to keep lying to him. So I told him all of it. The investigation, the evidence of fraud, the threats, the coercion, the fake phone call, everything. Liam's reaction surprised me. Instead of being afraid or asking me to stop, he got this determined look on his face that reminded me of how Head looked as a little boy when Head decided to accomplish something difficult. He called Harper over and said they were canceling their honeymoon. They'd been planning to go to Italy in 2 weeks, a trip they'd saved for and been excited about for months, but Liam said his mother needed help and everything else could wait. Harper didn't hesitate. She agreed immediately, saying family came first, and that they'd take their honeymoon later when this was over. I tried to argue, to tell them they didn't need to sacrifice their plans for me, but Liam cut me off. He said Eid spent his entire childhood sacrificing for him, and now it was his turn to stand by me. He said we were going to face this together, as a family, and that Gerald had made a huge mistake by threatening him because now Liam was personally invested in taking him down. But there was one more betrayal waiting for me. And this one hurt worse than all the others combined. My mother called me at Heather's house the next morning. Her voice sounded tired and old, and she asked me to please drop the investigation. I asked her if she knew what Gerald, Kenneth, and Raymond had done. The break-in, the threats, the fake emergency call about Liam. She was quiet for a long moment, and then she admitted she'd known for years about the business problems. She'd known Gerald was doing illegal things, cutting corners, bribing officials, hiding money. She'd known and said nothing, looked the other way, enjoyed the lifestyle that dirty money provided, while pretending she was innocent of it all. I felt something break inside me at that admission. I asked her how she could have known and never said anything, how she could have watched Gerald abuse me and humiliate me when she knew he was a criminal, when she knew he had no moral high ground to stand on. She said, in this small, defeated voice, that she was his wife, that she'd taken vows to stand by him, that she was asking me now, as my mother, to please stop this investigation before it destroyed everyone. I told her she was choosing him over me. Again, like she'd done my entire life. She started crying and said I was destroying the family, that I was being selfish and vindictive, that I didn't understand what it would mean for her if Gerald went to prison, if the money was gone, if the reputation they'd built for 50 years collapsed. I said, with a clarity and calmness that surprised even me, that she could have been different. She could have protected me as a child, stood up for me as an adult, been the mother I needed, instead of being Gerald's enabler. I told her that the family had been destroyed long before I started investigating, that she and Gerald and my siblings had destroyed it with lies and cruelty and criminal behavior. I said I was just exposing what was already rotten, and if she couldn't see that, then we had nothing left to say to each other. She begged me one more time to stop, to think about what this would do to her, and I told her Eid spent 47 years thinking about what my choices would do to everyone else, and now I was thinking about what was right. Then I hung up and blocked her number too. This third betrayal, this final abandonment by the woman who gave birth to me, was the worst of all. My father and brothers had never pretended to love me, not really. But my mother, it always held on to this hope that deep down she cared, that she was just weak, that if things were really bad enough she'd choose me. It'd been wrong. She'd known everything, had been complicit for decades, and she was choosing Gerald's comfort over justice, over me, over any sense of basic decency. I sat in Heather's living room and cried harder than I'd cried in years, grieving not just for my relationship with my mother but for the mother I'd wished I had and would never have. Liam held me while I cried, and when I finally calmed down enough to speak, he told me something that helped more than he probably knew. He said I'd always had him, that I'd always have Harper, that Heather and Derek and the friends I'd made outside my toxic blood family were my real family, and that he was proud of me for fighting back. Harper sat on my other side and said her own mother had died when she was 16, but if she'd lived, Harper would have wanted her to be exactly like me. Strong, principled, willing to stand up for what was right even when it cost her everything. Derek, standing in the doorway, added that I was the strongest person he knew, stronger than had ever been, and that I needed to finish this. Ross called that evening and said we had everything we needed. Federal prosecutors were interested, multiple agencies were coordinating investigations, and the evidence was overwhelming. He asked me one more time if I was absolutely certain I wanted to move forward, because once we turned over everything to the authorities, there was no going back. I looked at Liam, at Harper, at Heather, at Derek, all these people who loved me and supported me, and I thought about everyone Gerald had hurt over the years. I thought about Russell Hoffman, the construction worker lying in a hospital bed with a shattered spine because Gerald had used substandard scaffolding. I thought about the subcontractors who'd never been paid for their work. I thought about every person who'd been victimized by the Sawyer family's greed and corruption. And I said yes. I didn't care about the NDA ID signed under duress. I was giving everything to the authorities, and I was going to destroy them the same way they'd tried to destroy me, publicly, completely, and without mercy. I contacted a local investigative reporter named Claudia Martinez who worked for the Hartford Courant. Ross had suggested her because she'd built a reputation for exposing corporate corruption and wouldn't be intimidated by wealthy defendants. I met her at a diner far from my usual area, brought copies of everything Ross had compiled, and spent 3 hours walking her through the evidence. She asked tough questions, verified details, and by the end of our conversation, I could see the determination in her eyes. She said this was huge, that if everything I'd shown her was accurate, this was going to be front-page news for weeks. 2 weeks later, the story broke. The headline read, "Prominent Connecticut developer charged with $18 million fraud scheme." Gerald's photo was on the front page, and the article detailed years of fraudulent contracts, bribery, tax evasion, and unsafe working conditions that had injured multiple people. It didn't just name Gerald. It named Kenneth as his legal accomplice who'd helped cover up the fraud, and Raymond as a co-conspirator who'd used company money for personal gain. The story went viral locally, picked up by news stations, shared across social media. By noon that day, everyone in Connecticut knew the Sawyer name was synonymous with corruption. The legal consequences came fast and hard. The FBI raided the company offices with a warrant, seizing computers and files and carting out boxes of evidence. Gerald was arrested at his home, walked out in handcuffs in front of news cameras while neighbors watched. Bail was set at $500,000, which he eventually posted, but his assets were frozen pending investigation, so he had to sell property to come up with the cash. Kenneth was disbarred almost immediately. The Connecticut Bar Association moved faster than anyone expected, citing his role in falsifying legal documents and using his law license to facilitate criminal activity. His career was over. Raymond's properties were seized by the IRS as part of an asset forfeiture action because he couldn't prove they'd been purchased with legitimate income. He filed for bankruptcy within a month, and everything he'd built using Gerald's dirty money disappeared. The family's social fall was almost as dramatic as the legal consequences. Gerald's friends from the country club stopped returning his calls. The club itself revoked his membership, sending a formal letter explaining that they couldn't be associated with someone under federal indictment. The same people who'd laughed at his jokes and accepted his donations were suddenly treating him like a pariah. My mother had to move in with Beatrice because they lost the Greenwich house to foreclosure when Gerald couldn't make the mortgage payments with his assets frozen. Extended family members, cousins and aunts and uncles who'd always sucked up to Gerald because of his money, suddenly wanted nothing to do with any of us. The entire carefully constructed image of the successful Sawyer family crumbled in a matter of weeks. Gerald tried one final attack from jail. He called me collect, and I was so surprised by his audacity that I actually accepted the call. His voice was shaky with rage, and he said I'd destroyed my own family, that everything that was happening was my fault, that I'd brought shame on the Sawyer name that would last for generations. I listened to him rant for about 30 seconds, and then I cut him off. I told him that he'd destroyed himself, that I'd simply exposed crimes he'd chosen to commit, that the only thing I regretted was not standing up to him 30 years ago when maybe I could have stopped him before he hurt so many people. He said I'd regret this, that somehow he'd make me pay, and I laughed. I actually laughed, and I told him he had no power over me anymore, that he was sitting in a jail cell facing federal charges while I was free and finally at peace. Then I hung up and blocked the number. It was the last conversation I ever had with my father. Kenneth and Raymond tried their own confrontation about a week later. They showed up at my school during dismissal time, probably hoping to catch me off guard, but Id filed for a restraining order after the break-in, and campus security had been briefed. The moment they stepped onto school property, security detained them and called the police. Kenneth was screaming that they'd never forgive me, that I was a traitor to the family, that Id destroyed everything Gerald had built. Raymond just looked defeated, standing there with his shoulders slumped while police informed them they were violating a court order. I watched from the safety of my classroom window as they were escorted off campus, and I felt nothing but relief. They couldn't hurt me anymore. The law was protecting me now, and they were the ones facing consequences. The victory moments came in waves. Liam hugged me after the news story broke and told me he was so proud of me, that I'd shown more courage than anyone had ever known. Harper said I was the strongest woman she knew, and that she hoped their daughter, if they had one someday, would grow up to be like her grandmother. Heather threw a small celebration at her house with just Derek, Liam, Harper, and me, raising a glass to justice and freedom and the end of decades of abuse. Derek told me I'd done what had never had the courage to do when we were married, standing up to Gerald and refusing to be controlled, and that watching me fight back had been inspiring. Even people at school who'd heard about the news story stopped me in the hallways to say they were sorry I'd had to go through it but glad it exposed the truth. There was unexpected support from places I didn't anticipate. Lillian, Raymond's wife, filed for divorce 2 weeks after the arrests. She showed up at Heather's house one afternoon with her 2 kids and thanked me through tears. She said she'd known for years that Raymond was involved in something wrong, but she'd been too scared to leave, too worried about losing financial security and social status. Watching me stand up to the entire family had given her the courage to do the same, to get herself and her children away from the corruption and abuse. 3 former employees of Sawyer Construction came forward with their own stories of being asked to falsify documents or look the other way when safety violations occurred. The injured construction worker, Russell Hoffman, won his lawsuit and was awarded a significant settlement that would cover his medical bills and lost wages. Each of these victories, each person who was helped by the exposure of Gerald's crimes, made the cost feel more worthwhile. The trials took almost a year to wind through the legal system, but eventually, all 3 men were convicted. Gerald got 7 years in federal prison for fraud, tax evasion, and conspiracy. Kenneth got 5 years for his role in covering up the crimes and falsifying legal documents. Raymond got 3 years plus he was ordered to pay $2 million in restitution to victims of the fraud. I attended Gerald's sentencing, sitting in the back of the courtroom, watching him stand in an orange jumpsuit looking smaller and older than I'd ever seen him. When the judge asked if he had anything to say, Gerald started to speak, but his lawyer advised him to remain silent. He never once looked at me during the entire proceeding. When the bailiff led him away in shackles, I felt this huge weight lift from my chest. He couldn't hurt me anymore. He couldn't hurt anyone anymore. My mother tried one final time to reach out about 6 months after Gerald was sentenced. She came to Heather's house where I was still living while my apartment was being repaired and cleaned. Heather answered the door and was about to turn her away, but I said it was okay, that I'd talk to her. We sat in the living room, and my mother looked like she'd aged 10 years. She told me she'd lost everything. The house, the money, the social standing, all of it was gone. She was living with Beatrice and her husband, sleeping in their guest room, dependent on them for everything. She asked me if I could forgive her, if we could try to rebuild some kind of relationship. I looked at this woman who'd given birth to me but had never really been my mother, and I felt mostly sadness. I told her I could release her, meaning I could let go of my anger and resentment for my own peace, but that forgiveness would take time, maybe years, maybe never. I told her that a mother's job was to protect her children, and she'd protected her husband instead, enabling his abuse and his crimes for decades. I said I needed her to understand that there would be no relationship between us unless she was willing to fully acknowledge what she'd done, take responsibility for her choices, and accept that I might never fully trust her again. She started crying and said she was my mother, like that fact alone should erase everything. I told her that biology didn't obligate me to maintain a relationship with someone who'd harmed me, and that I was done prioritizing other people's comfort over my own well-being. Then I asked her to leave, and I haven't seen her since. I don't know if I'll ever talk to her again, and I've made peace with that uncertainty. The healing journey was long and difficult. I started therapy with a psychologist who specialized in trauma and family dysfunction. For months, I went twice a week, processing decades of abuse, learning to recognize patterns of manipulation, working through the guilt and shame that Gerald had spent a lifetime instilling in me. I joined a support group for adult children of narcissistic parents, and hearing other people's stories helped me realize I wasn't alone, that toxic families were more common than I'd thought, and that choosing to walk away was sometimes the healthiest option. I started writing in a journal, documenting my story not just as therapy but as a record of survival. Some part of me thought that maybe someday, my story could help someone else find the courage to stand up to their own abusive family. I reconnected with extended family members, cousins I'd lost touch with over the years, who reached out after learning the truth. Several of them told me they'd always suspected something was wrong but hadn't known how bad it was. They apologized for believing Gerald's lies about me, and slowly, carefully, I started building relationships with the family members who were willing to see me for who I really was. Liam and Harper announced they were pregnant about 8 months after the trials ended, and the news filled me with more joy than I thought possible. I was going to be a grandmother. I was going to have the chance to show a new generation what real family love looked like. One morning, about a year after everything started, I was at Liam and Harper's house helping them paint the nursery. Harper asked me what I wanted my granddaughter to know about me. I held the paint roller for a moment, thinking, and then I told her I wanted Evelyn, that's what they were naming her, to know that her grandmother had been called an embarrassment but had refused to accept that lie. I wanted her to know that I'd been knocked down 7 times and stood up 8. I wanted her to know that I'd lost a family of blood but gained a family of choice. I wanted her to know that I'd learned the hardest lesson there is, that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is walk away from people who hurt you, even when they're family. Liam came over and put his arm around me, and the 3 of us stood there looking at the pale yellow walls that would soon welcome a new baby, and I felt something I hadn't felt in decades. I felt genuinely happy. I published an article about my experience called "When Family is Toxic: My Story." It was published in a national magazine, and the response was overwhelming. I received hundreds of messages from people thanking me for speaking out, sharing their own stories of family abuse and manipulation, telling me it'd given them hope that they could escape too. I was invited to speak at a domestic abuse conference, even though my abuse hadn't been physical, because the organizers understood that emotional and financial abuse were just as destructive. I used the platform to talk about the specific dynamics of family scapegoating, about how narcissistic parents create hierarchies among their children, about how abuse thrives in silence and can only be stopped when victims refuse to stay quiet. Each person I helped, each message I received saying "id" made a difference, felt like another piece of healing. The final scene in this story happened about 18 months after Gerald was sentenced. I was at Liam and Harper's house holding my granddaughter Evelyn, who was 3 months old and absolutely perfect. She had Harper's eyes and Liam's smile, and holding her felt like holding pure possibility. Liam sat down next to me and asked what I wanted Evelyn to know about her grandmother as she grew up. I looked at this tiny human who would grow up in a home full of love, who would never experience the cruelty I'd endured, who would be raised by parents who'd learned from my mistakes and my courage. I told Liam I wanted Evelyn to know that her grandmother had been called an embarrassment but had refused to let that define her. I wanted her to know that I'd been knocked down repeatedly but had always gotten back up. I wanted her to know that I'd lost a family of blood but gained a family of choice, and that sometimes the people who share your DNA are less family than the people who choose to love you. Most importantly, I wanted her to know that standing up for what's right is hard and costly, but it's always worth it in the end. Looking back on everything, I can see clearly now what I couldn't see at the time. My father introduced me as the family embarrassment at my son's wedding, and in doing so, he set off a chain of events that would cost him everything. He lost his freedom, spending years in federal prison. He lost his money, all of it seized or spent on legal fees and restitution. He lost his reputation, his name forever associated with fraud and corruption. He lost his family, with my mother reduced to dependence on others. Kenneth disbarred and unemployable, Raymond bankrupt, and Beatrice barely speaking to any of them. But what Gerald lost was nothing compared to what I gained. I lost the toxic family I'd been born into, but it never truly had them anyway. What I gained was worth infinitely more: my dignity, my peace, my truth, and my freedom. To anyone watching this who's living with a cruel family, I want you to hear this. You are not the embarrassment. The people who treat you that way are embarrassed by their own failures and projecting onto you. It took me 47 years to learn this lesson. Don't wait as long as I did. Your worth was never determined by their opinion. Real family lifts you up. Anything else is just shared DNA. And you're not obligated to maintain relationships with people who harm you just because you're related by blood. Stand up, speak your truth, walk away if you must, and know that on the other side of that courage is a life free from abuse. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to cut ties with toxic family members? How did you find the strength to do it? Drop your story in the comments below, because your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear to find their own courage. If this story resonated with you, hit that like button and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, because stories like these, stories about survival and justice and finding strength you didn't know you had, these are the stories that matter. Thank you for watching, for listening, and for being part of a community that believes survivors and supports people finding their way out of darkness. I'm sending strength to anyone who needs it today. Remember, you're not alone, you're not the problem, and you deserve so much better than abuse. Stay strong, stay brave, and know that freedom is possible.